The Arctic stretched endlessly, a vast white desert of ice and silence. The wind howled, carrying with it an unforgiving chill that cut through even the thickest of coats. Snowflakes swirled in the air, illuminated by the dim glow of the evening sky, casting long shadows on the frozen ground. Amidst this icy wilderness, a small wooden cabin stood alone, nestled between towering ice cliffs. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, the only sign of warmth in an otherwise frigid and desolate world. Inside the cabin, an old man sat near a crackling fire, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. His face, lined with years of solitude and hardship, was illuminated by the flickering flames. His name was Elias, a man who had chosen isolation after losing his wife. He had once been a wildlife researcher, a man of science and discovery, but grief had pulled him away from the world. Now, he lived alone in the Arctic, observing nature from a distance, never interfering. As he sat in silence, listening to the wind outside, a faint sound reached his ears. It was different from the usual howling of the wind, something softer yet filled with desperation. He frowned, setting down his cup. He pulled on his heavy coat, stepped outside, and let the cold bite at his skin as he strained to listen. The sound came again, a weak, pitiful whimper. His sharp eyes scanned the landscape, searching for the source. Near the edge of his cabin, barely visible against the snow, lay a small, unmoving shape. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the ice. Lying in the snow was a tiny polar bear cub, barely alive. Its fur was stiff with frost, and its tiny body trembled from the cold. Dark, glassy eyes flickered open for a brief moment before closing again as it let out another weak cry. Elias hesitated. He knew the dangers of interfering with wild animals. If the mother was nearby, she would return, and he would be in serious trouble. He scanned the horizon, but there was nothing. The Arctic stretched endlessly in every direction, silent and empty. The cub was alone. Taking a deep breath, Elias removed his thick scarf and carefully wrapped the tiny creature in it. The cub barely resisted, too weak to fight. Holding it close to his chest, he hurried back inside, shutting the door against the cold. Inside, the warmth of the fire slowly began to thaw the frozen cub. Elias wrapped it in another thick blanket and placed it near the hearth. The little bear whimpered softly, curling into the warmth, its body still shivering but no longer fading away. Elias rummaged through his supplies, finally finding a bottle of milk he had kept for stray dogs that sometimes wandered near his cabin. He warmed it slightly and brought it to the cub's mouth. At first, the tiny creature was too weak to drink, but after a few coaxing attempts, it latched onto the bottle and drank greedily. "You're a fighter," Elias murmured, watching the tiny bear gulp down the milk. As the night stretched on, Elias remained by the cub's side, ensuring it stayed warm and safe. When the wind howled against the cabin walls, the little bear flinched but pressed closer to him. For the first time in years, Elias felt something stir in his chest, something other than loneliness. Days passed, and the cub began to recover. Its once frail body grew stronger, its movements more energetic. Elias named him Nainuk, after the old Inuit word for polar bear. Nainuk followed him everywhere, waddling clumsily around the cabin, often tripping over his own oversized paws. He would paw at Elias's boots, gnawing playfully at the laces, and curl up near the fire each night, letting out soft, contented huffs as he drifted into sleep. Elias found himself laughing more than he had in years. He had always believed he was content in his solitude, but Nainuk changed everything. The cub wasn't just an animal, he was a companion, a source of warmth in the otherwise cold and silent world Elias had built for himself. As the weeks passed, Nanook grew larger and more confident. His once clumsy steps became steady, his playful nips turned into rougher, more forceful nudges. He was no longer a helpless cub, but a young bear with the strength of his wild ancestors. Elias knew the truth he had been avoiding. Nanook did not belong in the cabin. He belonged in the wild. One morning, Elias prepared for the journey he had been dreading. He harnessed his sled dogs, packed enough supplies, and secured a place for Nanook. His heart ached as he loaded everything onto the sled. Nanook watched him with curious eyes, his large paws crunching the snow as he trotted toward Elias. Elias knelt beside him, placing a rough, calloused hand on the young bear's head. "You were never meant to stay with me," he murmured. "You're meant to be free." Nanook let out a soft whimper, nudging Elias's hand with his wet nose. The journey was long, the icy winds relentless. Elias kept his focus on the path ahead, determined not to let his emotions get the better of him. The wildlife reserve was a few days' journey away, a place where Nanook could be cared for and gradually reintroduced into the wild. When they finally arrived, Elias was greeted by the reserve's caretakers, who assured him that Nanook would be well looked after. They examined the bear, impressed by how strong and healthy he had become. As they led Nanook away, the young bear turned back, locking eyes with Elias. It was a look of understanding, a silent farewell. Elias stood there for a long moment, watching until Nanook disappeared from sight. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, the wind carrying the echoes of his footsteps across the frozen land. Returning to the cabin felt different. The fire still crackled in the hearth, but the space felt emptier. The silence was deeper, more profound. Yet, as he sat near the fire, sipping his tea, he felt something he hadn't in years. A sense of peace. Nanook had given him more than just companionship. He had reminded Elias what it meant to care, to feel, to truly live again. The wind whispered through the Arctic night, and Elias closed his eyes. He had saved Nanook, but in many ways Nanook had saved him too.